So this is Crater Bay, which is part of the Sydney Harbour National Park, and what you can see is along the coastlines in this area we have a lot of natural rocky shoreline, and you can see that this is quite complex and robust compared to what you get in a man-made rocky shoreline. And as you can look along the coastline, you can see that in this area, the intertidal zone is what it's called because it goes between high and low tide. You'll get some species that grow within this intertidal zone, and if you look at it from afar, you can see that there's a lot of algae and various other things that are growing along the coast. You can see here in the foreground against the water we've got a lot of kelp and various seaweeds that are growing in this area, some of it growing on the base of these rocks. And this is an area where we do get a lot of fish that grow, in particular tropical recruits that are coming down with climate change from the Great Barrier Reef will grow in these sorts of areas. But if you start looking closer in at some of these rocks and what's actually growing here, you can see that there's a lot more diversity than what meets the eye when you look at it with first glance. So for example, on this rock here that we have in front of us, in the upper intertidal zone, it looks relatively barren, but as you start moving down, you can see that on the ground we have various species of limpets, which are these little round-shaped organisms, and they basically cling to the rock. They're a mollusk like a snail, and so they'll cling to the rock during high tide, or low tide, and dry out. You can also see these white fuzzy-looking things. These are tube worms, and tube worms release a calcareous shell, which is hard, like the shell of a snail. And those guys will come out during high tide when the water's above them, and they have these feeding heads that basically stick out and filter stuff from the water. A little below the area where the limpets are grazing, you don't get a lot of algae growing there. You start seeing some algae growing away from the area where the limpets are moving around, and you start seeing various other organisms along with the algae. So for example, here, these green blobs that you see in front of us here, these are actually sea squirts, and if you touch one of them and you squeeze it, you can see water squirting out of it. So these are sea squirts themselves. And so what I'm just trying to show you is that if you look very closely at these shorelines, instead of looking at it from the gross perspective that we're normally used to seeing these shorelines, they're actually quite diverse and very important for supporting local biodiversity in places like Sydney Harbour.